Hello, listeners. It's been a while, 5.5 months by my count, since you've heard from us. What's up with that? Where's the show? Where's the updates? Are you guys even alive? All valid questions, probably the questions I'd be asking myself in such circumstances. I won't dwell on the question long because it's entirely possible a good many of you don't care one bit about that and you just want to hear about how something as mundane as molasses can end in disaster. But for those of you who have been fans of the show for a while now, I'll give you a bit of an update. There are a variety of reasons Michael and I have been missing in action, but at the heart of all of those things lies a very simple common denominator. Put plainly, we overestimated what we could do and we wore ourselves too thin. Both of us already had 9-to-5 jobs when we started this, but I thought that I would be transitioning out of mine to focus on podcasting and voiceover full-time, so I thought, hey, why don't I just start a monthly podcast in the meantime? Eventually, however, my place of work made me an offer too good to refuse, and so I was stuck working from before sunup to after sundown. I won't bore you with the details, but I sacrificed my private life and took on a steady diet of sleeping pills to maintain a consistent output. As you might imagine, that's not a sustainable way to live. Michael also moved about 2.5 hours away, which didn't help things. He's got his own job stuff he's dealing with now, so between the both of us, we kinda had to take a breather for the sake of our own sanity. So I'll tell you briefly where things stand, and then I'll introduce the show. So while the idea of starting a podcast series on a specific topic sounded like a good idea on paper, it really hasn't translated well in practice. If we were able to give Grisly History the hours it deserves, I think we could have knocked out the whole Ends of the Earth saga in about 6 months, which is what we originally intended. But of course things didn't go as intended, and so the content is stagnated. I think with a show like this, a better format would be to have a new topic every episode so you can keep the material fresh and allow the audience to jump in and out wherever they want to. And that's how I'd like to run things moving forward, but in all honesty, that's going to be a while away. We still have to finish the series, and so my tentative goal is to wrap everything up before the end of the year. But even after that, Michael and I are going to go on indefinite hiatus to reassess how we're going to do things and how we can do them sustainably. To all of you who have held out in spite of the silence, I want to say thank you. We just passed our 1-year mark on September 1st, and it has been remarkable to see just how many people have come to enjoy the show. But with that said, let's get on with the show. So what you're going to be listening to is an episode we recorded months ago, back when I thought I was on the cusp of ramping things up with the show and voiceover. This was an idea we had where we would create shorter shows between regular episodes that give a fuller story to our TikToks. And by the way, if you don't know, we do have a few TikToks if you're on the app. It was going to be a Patreon exclusive, but given the circumstances, we've suspended our Patreon, and we're just going to share whatever we make on the main channel for the time being. But with that said, what follows is a discussion between Michael and I as we discuss a strange and horrifying disaster that befell the city of Boston just over 100 years ago, when on a cold winter day, North End residents were subjected to the terror of an event remembered today as the Great Molasses Flood. Hey everybody, I'm Graham Parker.
And I'm Michael Ruiz.
And welcome to the first episode of a as-of-yet unnamed series where we are going behind the short-form content that we produce in our TikToks and Instagram stories and trying to tell you a little bit more about it. You know, when Michael and I are making these videos, we have maybe 10 lines of text and script, but we have like 2 pages of notes under that. And we just thought it'd be a good idea to try to flesh out some of those stories. So we're going to kick things off with our most recent video about the Boston Molasses Flood, or the Great Molasses Disaster. So Michael, I'm curious, before we did the video, had you heard of the Boston Molasses Disaster?
I actually hadn't. That idea, along with several other ideas, are pulled from a TikTok comment section we had on the Bhopal disaster, which was, it kind of blew up a little bit on TikTok, and we were just looking through and seeing what we could discover, and I remember we came across the Boston Molasses disaster, and I remember Graham had mentioned something about how he had heard of it. I was kind of taken aback. I had recently been to Boston, and I was a little confused as to how that worked. So yeah, this was a completely new topic for me, both strange and sad and interesting. It's just up our alley, I would say, here for Grisly History.
Yeah, I definitely say that's par for the course. Yeah, it's really strange. To be honest with you, I think my only experience with it, I'd probably seen like a weird history YouTube video or something on it. So it was a lot of fun to read about. One thing I really enjoyed when I was in college, writing history papers, and I had access to archives as I'd be focusing on a topic. And like I do an initial read and I'd pick out some characters or maybe some key points in the story. But then as I go back through and I read like a different article or a different first person account, I watch these people and these events get fleshed out. And I kind of had that experience a little bit doing it with this. So that was pretty fun. And so hopefully I can distill a little bit of that to you.
Yeah, when I was originally going through the script, we were taking a look before Graham was recording it. I was kind of surprised because not only was I in Boston recently, I was on all of these exact streets, this area. For those of you who haven't been to Boston, Massachusetts, there's kind of a downtown core area that's near the Boston Common. And then across where a freeway used to be, now it's like a greenway, is the north end of the city. And that's kind of the famous part. That's where most of the events that kind of led up to the Declaration of Independence and early colonial America took place. And that was the area that I had walked around and had taken some photos. And so, yeah, it was a little surprising to hear that this was where such a weird and unique disaster took place.
Yeah, Boston in particular has so much history so close together because, you know, I would be reading about one area of the city and then I'd read about the place next door. And I was like, oh, wait, this, that, and the other happened there. But our story today takes place in 1919. And like you mentioned, it's on the north end of the Boston Harbor. Specifically, it was at 529 Commerce Street near Kearny Square. So from what I could tell, a lot of places in this area had Irish names, Irish street names, Irish places. I'm guessing it was probably like a blue-collar immigrant neighborhood. The main source from this, the author of the 2003 book, Dark Tide, The Great Molasses Flood, which is a phenomenal book about this disaster, actually said that the area was about 90% Italian makeup at the time that the disaster occurred. So he got interested in the topic while doing his master's thesis on Italian immigrants. So if you can just kind of imagine this harbor area with a nearby neighborhood with a sort of mixed Irish-Italian population, that's kind of what we've got going into this. So the broad strokes of it is that in January of 1919, a industrial-sized storage tank full of molasses exploded and inundated the nearby neighborhood, ripping buildings off their foundations and drowning people and animals in its wake. But to give some context behind that, let's talk about the tank itself. This tank was owned by the Purity Distilling Company, which was a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. So Purity Distilling kept a number of these tanks on the north end of the harbor, specifically for molasses coming in from Canada, to be offloaded and piped to Cambridge. And I didn't realize it until I was looking into it. Cambridge is like 6 miles away from Boston. It's real close.
It's very close. It's maybe a 20-minute train ride.
So yeah, they would take this molasses and they would get it hot and they would pipe it to Cambridge, where it would go to a distilling facility where they would ferment it to make ethanol, obviously for alcohol. Now, the tank in question, when I say it was like an industrial-sized tank, it was 50 feet wide, 90 feet tall, and it could hold something like 2 million gallons. Purity Distilling had the tank constructed in 1915, and subsequent investigations in the disaster would conclude that it was poorly constructed and maintained. So, Michael, when you think about designing an industrial tank, what kind of person do you think would be responsible for its construction and oversight?
Well, I have a feeling I know somewhat where this is going, but I think it would make sense to hire engineers, experts in the field, someone who has prior experience building such a device, such a storage unit. But I'm sure you're about to tell me that this was not the case.
Yeah, so all that would be wise, but the Industrial Alcohol Company thought it was best to leave it to their treasurer, a man named Arthur Gell.
That's a good start. Off to a good start already.
Yeah, and Arthur Gell, as a treasurer, had no architectural or engineering experience, but he oversaw its construction, and he tested the tank. He tested it by filling it with water and checking for leaks and listening for any groans as the density would increase from within. Now, Arthur concluded that it groaned every single time they filled it up, but he didn't think it was serious. This was, of course, concluded by a man who didn't have the training to know whether or not it was serious. In the 4 years between the construction and the disaster, the tank was filled approximately 30 times. During these times, it was noted by some of the staff later interviewed that there were noticeable stress cracks around the rivets. In fact, in its last year, the cracks were so great that molasses would actually seep out of these cracks, and passing workers would wipe some off, eat it, and keep walking. So nearly 100 years after the disaster, a structural and metallurgical engineer named Ronald Merivale sat down and he examined the materials used in the tank's construction. And he determined that the biggest problem was that the rivets that held the tank together were lacking a mineral called manganese. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I'm not a metallurgical engineer, so I can't really contest to how important this is, but he contends that manganese is required for structures that regularly encounter high tension because without it, the metal becomes brittle and less flexible. So in his mind, it made the most sense that these cracks would develop around these overstressed rivets. And as bad as that is, Merivale also stated that the steel panels which made up the walls of this tank were about 50% too thin to sustain the kind of pressure that it was expected to put up with, even by the relaxed standards at the time. Management was evidently made aware of this, and I say that because shortly before the disaster, the steel blue exterior of this tank was painted reddish brown so the leaks wouldn't be noticeable.
You gotta love the solution designed to handle the optics of the situation and not the actual problem.
So this brings us to the day in question, January 15th, 1919, and the question of why did the tank pop? Obviously, January is a very cold time of year in Boston, especially if you're right there on the water by the harbor. In the previous days, the tank had been partially filled with molasses, but the company wanted it to be all the way full before they piped it to Cambridge. Now, the thing about molasses you have to remember is it's very viscous. It's about 40% denser than water. And temperature really kind of affects the viscosity. The colder it is, molasses is going to contract and harden, while the warmer it is, it's easier to flow. Hence why you hear, slow as molasses in winter. So the way they moved the molasses was by heating it up and getting it hot and piping it into the tank.
So anytime molasses would hit the tank, it would always be hot in order to transport it.
Yeah, exactly. And the same for when they wanted to send it from the tank to Cambridge. So the previous day, they had piped hot molasses into this tank, where it hardened in the cold winter air and put stress on the rivets. So January the 15th arrives, and they top off the tank. The heat of this new molasses began to heat up the older, colder molasses, causing it to lose the density that it had and begin to expand. Now, this alone wouldn't have caused the entire tank to heat up, but there was another temperature at play. The day before, the temperature had been 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but by noon of the 15th, it had risen all the way to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And this brings us to the crossroads of two prevailing theories of what happened next. Either, one, the sudden buildup of temperatures caused the molasses to begin fermenting, which created a high production of CO2, and having no way to release it, the gas built up, causing the tank to explode. Or two, thermal expansion simply caused the volume of liquid to increase too quickly, overwhelming the brittle supports. Neither of these has been definitively established and, probably never will, but it doesn't really matter because the result was the same. So the thing about it is that nobody who survived the disaster actually saw the explosion. One of the miracles of it actually was that when it occurred at 12:30, all the dock workers were at lunch, so none of them were nearby. However, those who were close by reported hearing a sound like a machine gun going off, followed by a roar, which sounded like one of the elevated trains going overhead. What they likely were hearing were the rivets giving way and shooting out, followed by the sound of the tank literally exploding. When the tank blew, it created a wave approximately 30 feet tall, traveling 35 miles an hour, with molasses flowing out in every direction, going down into the harbor, knocking out dockside buildings, and even going uphill into the surrounding neighborhood. The worst damage was done to the neighboring buildings, where shards of the steel tank cut through the walls of a nearby freight house, killing everybody inside. Offices and municipal buildings were ripped off their foundation and collapsed, killing those inside. At a nearby firehouse, Engine 31, there were 4 firemen engaged in a lunchtime card game, and one of them said that at one moment they were playing cards, they heard this roar, and the entire building moved, throwing one of them out of a window and collapsing the walls around them. So they were stuck in this weird air pocket where they only had about an 18-inch gap and molasses below them, and they had to hold their head up to avoid drowning inside of it. Trucks and carriages along the dock were picked up and thrown into the harbor. There was an account of a worker who was working on the dock. His name was Isaac Yeton, and he was loading inner tubes into a shed when suddenly he said he saw a train car coming out of him off the tracks along with freight boxes sliding towards him. Thinking that the sound that he had heard was a train derailment, he ran over to it and immediately was knocked off his feet and covered head to toe in molasses. He was carried by the wave and thought he was going to be thrown into the harbor, but his foreman happened to be nearby, and he threw a ladder to him, and he was able to hang on to it until the wave passed by him. Meanwhile, the wave crossed Commercial Street, making its way into the surrounding neighborhood. And as the wave plowed across the street, it sent debris careening into one of the main supports of the elevated train track while a train was going over it. The conductor managed to hold it together. It knocked it off the track, but it was able to regain traction. And he stopped it. And when he got out, he looked down at the carnage below him, and he saw that the area he had just passed by, the support was out and the tracks were sagging. And at the time, trains were expected to come through every 7 minutes, and he knew there was another train coming. So he bravely crossed over this damaged track and was able to wave down the next train and stop it before it passed over that point. Did you happen to ride one of these elevated trains when you were there?
I did, and if this is in the area that I'm picturing, for those of you who have not been to Boston, again, the North End is a massively dense and confusing string of roads. Boston was almost entirely an island when it was first founded, and the city kind of grew from there. In fact, at high tide, there was no access to the city itself. It was completely an island. And the result of that is a whole mix of roads. Later on, they terraformed the surrounding area to give themselves more land. So, as anyone will tell you when you first visit Boston, is never rent a car. Advice I should have listened to myself personally. And these elevated tracks, if they're at where I think they're at, it's just a very central location to where you can kind of look down and see the rest of the city. So I can very easily picture this vantage point, and that's just kind of a terrifying thought.
Yeah, I know. It's lunchtime. You're on this train. You feel it literally get knocked off the tracks. You look out the window, and there's just a brown river running by, and debris and carts and trucks and all that. Part of the debris that wound up hitting this main support for the elevated train tracks was the house of 65-year-old Bridget Clougherty. I apologize to anybody Irish listening. I have horrible pronunciation. But Bridget, along with 2 sons and her daughter, were having lunch when the explosion of the tank let out such a rush of air that it created a vacuum so strong it ripped her house in half, taking her on one side and leaving her family on the other. It literally sucked it out into the street and collapsed, killing her. Her children searched for her body for about an hour before she was found, and they later tried to argue in court that their 34-year-old brother, Stephen, had also died as a result of the disaster. I don't really know much about Stephen's story, but he was committed to an insane asylum shortly after the disaster and died. But the damage didn't end there. Still traveling uphill, it managed to knock down another house a street over. That was the house of 78-year-old Elizabeth O'Brien. O'Brien could remember stepping out of her house with a load of laundry, turning over her shoulder to tell her sister where she was going, before hearing a roar and then blacking out. When she woke up, she was completely covered in molasses, had a broken jaw, and her house was collapsed. She looked for her sister for about 4 days before she was finally found in a nearby hospital, having been disfigured and suffered a stroke.
I think when you picture something that's called the Molasses disaster, I don't think you entirely picture something that is this violent and this intense. It's almost ironically named if it was not a literal description of what is occurring here, which is just a violent explosion basically tearing apart an entire dense city core.
Yeah, it's a strange thought that this just household object you use to make syrups or add to recipes could, again, like you said, be so violent as to tear buildings off of its foundation and drown people. Because, it wasn't just tearing up buildings, it was just sweeping people off their feet. There was one man named Giuseppe who was eating lunch in his apartment. He was watching his 10-year-old son collect firewood down below when he saw him overtaken by the wave and just disappear. Because that was the thing about it. I mean, when it washed over you, you turned brown like it did, and you're just part of this wave. And he searched for a number of hours, but he didn't find him. His body was located the next day, but couldn't even be identified until a number of weeks later because of what the molasses did to him. Some of the bodies that washed in the harbor weren't even found for 3 or 4 months. And by that time, the decomposition due to the ocean made them next to impossible to identify. And some bodies weren't even found. There was an 18-year-old Peter Shaughnessy who was on his first day of the job of being a teamster. This is a person that drives a team of horses. So, they would load up his cart and he would drive it to wherever it needed to go. When the explosion happened, a wave carried the cart, horse and all, away. The next day, his horse was found dead, still tied to the cart, but he was never found. So you really have to imagine actually being in the molasses. It was boiling hot when it exploded. So people close by to it actually suffered burns. But then, when it hits that cold winter air, it begins to harden and stick. And it was described as being like quicksand. When you got in it, you couldn't really get back out of it easily because it cooled very quickly in the 40-degree air. I read one reporter who was on the scene describe it like this, quote, "There was no escape from the wave. Caught, human being and animal alike could not flee. Running in it was impossible. Snared in its flood was to be stifled. Once it smeared a head, human or animal, there was no coughing off the sticky mass. To attempt to wipe it away with hands was to make it worse. Most of those who died from suffocation. It plugged nostrils, almost airtight." Unquote. And I saw another that said, "Here and there struggled to form. Whether it was animal or human being was impossible to tell. Only an upheaval, a thrashing about in the sticky mass, showed where any life was."
It almost sounds like being drowned in boiling hot tar.
But this is what the residents had to wade into when they began pulling people out. The streets were immediately flooded by friends and neighbors going to check on family members and friends, attempting to pull them from the debris. The first proper rescue effort was conducted by 116 cadets of the Massachusetts Nautical School who happened to be doing maneuvers nearby. They did what they could with their hands and with ropes, but eventually firefighters and police showed up in rubber waders and tools that could clear the debris. It was extremely difficult work as the molasses stood knee-high in some parts of the city. They couldn't get to all the victims immediately. I read one story about a stonecutter named John Barry who was trapped in a collapsed building, and they were able to clear enough debris to see him, but because of the way he was in there, they couldn't pull him straight out. So for hours, there were these workers overhead with axes and crowbars trying to get him out, and every couple of hours, somebody would volunteer and crawl through the muck and the debris and inject him with morphine until they could finally get him out of there. And that's kind of what the men at Engine 31 were dealing with. They had to scream out until somebody finally heard them and began to cut them free. It took about 3 hours until they finally got them out, but by that time, 38-year-old George LaHaye lost his strength and drowned in the narrow gap, and his fellow firefighters just couldn't keep him up. In addition to the human victims, there were also an unknown number of horses and pets that died as a result. Some were knocked down outright, while others were injured so grievously as to be put out of their misery. In fact, one statement I read said that the most haunting part of that day was the night when they heard the interspersed sounds of the groaning and neighing of horses and the gunshots as the police put them down. Rescue efforts lasted for about 4 days before it turned into a cleanup operation. Several hundred municipal workers and volunteers worked for weeks, cleaning up debris by salting the streets and every surface and scrubbing as best they could. But real, meaningful progress didn't happen until they were able to turn fire hoses on it. And the harbor itself actually required a fire ship, which normally puts out fires on other boats, to come and turn its most powerful hose on it. But even so, the harbor remained brown for months afterwards, as the molasses that they had blown off got caught in the tide and just kind of stayed there. And for local residents, the memory of the disaster didn't end there. For decades afterwards, you had people claiming that on hot days you could smell the molasses seeping up through the pavement. And some of these tales were probably blown out of proportion, but I did read one thing I found kind of compelling. Stephen Puello, the author of Dark Tide, said that while promoting the book, he met an older man who had been a city meter reader back in the 50s and 60s. And he said that he would go into these old basements of these historic buildings and you could still smell the molasses down there. So that kind of rings true for me that, in these crooks and crannies, they probably didn't get down there and really clean them out. So, it's definitely believable that even decades afterwards, you could still smell it.
Yeah. Like I was saying earlier, that specific section of Boston is such a maze. It would be almost impossible to try to clear out that entire area.
Okay, but let's talk about the big picture. This is a pretty dark chapter in Boston's history, but what makes it historically significant? Well, for one, let's talk about the victims. Following the disaster, 21 people were confirmed dead, with 119 victims filing a class action lawsuit against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, alongside multiple state and city investigations. Now, the class action lawsuit claimed that the company's gross negligence was the sole cause for the property damage and loss of life, but the company said that they were in full compliance of the law, and rather than wasting time investigating them, the government should be investigating anarchists. They made this claim because the distillery evidently sold some of their ethanol to the United States Army for ordnance, therefore making it an ideal target for a terrorist attack. So at this time, the country was going through the first Red Scare when it was anarchists instead of communists that were the focus. And Boston actually had its fair share of anarchist violence. I think the Haymarket affair probably happened like 2 decades before this. So it's kind of understandable how they would make that pivot. But Judge Hugh Ogden ruled that it was a lack of oversight and common sense, and so made a judgment that they would have to pay the victims. The company wound up paying a total of $628,000 to the victims, or the modern-day equivalent of $10 million. Interestingly, he had discretion for how he divvied out these payments. To the families of those who died outright, he gave a judgment of $6,000, or the modern-day equivalent of $104,000 per victim. But to the families of those who suffered, like George LaHaye in that firehouse, he granted a judgment of $7,500 or $130,000. And that's just kind of a strange position to be in, but I guess it's natural to want to compensate someone differently based upon their family members' suffering.
It's hard to put a price point on suffering and death, so I think anytime they're doing something like this, it's kind of a tricky balancing act. I mean, what is it worth at the end of the day?
Well, beyond the victims, it's also had repercussions on structural licensing laws. It started in Massachusetts, but eventually rippled out into other states, with laws being passed that required structures to have a licensed architect or engineer to approve designs, and that they should show their work as a part of that. Something that seems common sense and like it shouldn't take a disaster to get that legislated, but that's what it took. And to reference Stephen Puello again, he said that the disaster did for construction laws what the Coconut Grove fire did for fire codes. And if you don't know what that is, the Coconut Grove was actually a nightclub in Boston, of all places, that caught on fire, killing something like 500 people as a result of doors being blocked, having a lot of highly flammable material, and of course being overcrowded. That's actually probably a story for another episode, now that I think about it. Now, I've seen it speculated, but I didn't find any clear conclusion that the company may have been playing loose and fast with how much they were filling the tank up as a result of trying to outrun Prohibition. The 18th Amendment had been proposed all the way back in 1917, but funny enough, wasn't passed until the day after the disaster. And then a year and a day after that, the Volstead Act, the actual teeth of enforcement, was passed in 1920, beginning those 13 years of Prohibition. Anyway, to put a bookend on this, a century after the disaster, on a mild winter afternoon, a group went to the site of the disaster, what is now a recreational complex owned by the city. Using ground-penetrating radar, the group located the site of the slab where the tank once stood, 20 inches below the baseball diamond. There the group stood in a circle while the names of the 21 victims were solemnly read. Some left flowers, others left jars of molasses, which I don't know, that's like going to a Titanic memorial and bringing ice cubes. I don't really know how the victims would feel about that.
It's a little dark, I will say.
But now on that site, there's a plaque which reads, on January 15th, 1919, a molasses tank at 529 Commercial Street exploded under pressure, killing 21 people. A 40-foot wave of molasses buckled the elevated railroad tracks, crushed buildings, and inundated the neighborhood. Structural defects in the tanks combined with an unseasonably warm temperature contributed to the disaster. So yeah, that's the story of the Boston molasses disaster. Have you got any closing thoughts on that?
I think it's interesting that history is full of these events that are strange and terrible and in some ways darkly ironic. And it's interesting to take a closer look at a story that could also just be a short 1-minute video like the one we made. Just a fascinating curiosity. And especially in a city like Boston where you're surrounded by these big mythic stories of the founding of our country, it could be really easy to miss a small plaque at the edge of a recreational center talking about this little known story. So I just find it interesting to take a closer look and see what really happened.
And thank you again to the viewers who suggested it. And stay posted on social media too, because Michael is actually going back to Boston sometime this autumn, and maybe we'll have to get a picture of that plaque.
Maybe I will.
Well, until next time, I am Graham Parker.
And I'm Michael Ruiz.
And thank you for listening.